On March 4th, 1865, at the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C., Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, gave his second inaugural address. A few feet from him stood John Wilkes Booth. He was a handsome, famous actor from Maryland, and he hated President Lincoln, who had abolished slavery. He also had designed a plan to kidnap the president. He even had some accomplices that would help him in his plan. He had David Harold, Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, Samuel Arnold, Michael O'Laughlin, John Surratt, and Mary Surratt. 2 weeks after the inauguration, Booth told his conspirators about his plot at a Washington restaurant. He said they were going to tie Lincoln up and take him to Richmond. He even included that they were going to force Lincoln to free all Confederate prisoners. On April 3rd, Lincoln went to Richmond, and there he sat in Jefferson Davis's chair. Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederate States that had seceded from the Union in 1861 that started the Civil War. 6 days later, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The Civil War was over. The war had lasted for 4 long years, and over 600,000 lives were lost. 2 days after the surrender, Lincoln gave a little speech. David Harold, Lewis Powell, and John Wilkes Booth were there at the speech. "That is the last speech you'll ever make. Now, by God, I'll put it through." That night, when Lincoln was asleep, he had a terrible dream. He walked into the east room of the White House, and there he saw a coffin. "Who is dead in the White House?" he asked a soldier. "The president," was his answer. "He was killed by an assassin." Lincoln slept no more that night. 3 days later, on April 14th, Booth went to Ford's Theater and got some mail. There, he learned the president would be attending the play Our American Cousin there that night. Then, he switched his plan from kidnap to murder. Harold and Powell agreed to help Booth. George Atzerodt wanted to stay out of the plan, but Booth threatened to kill Atzerodt if he didn't do what he told him to. Later that day, Lincoln went on a carriage ride with his wife, Mary. Lincoln wanted to invite Grant to the theater, but his wife and Mary did not get along. During the ride, Lincoln said to his wife, "We should be more cheerful in the future." Booth had assigned Powell to assassinate the Secretary of State, William Seward, who was recovering from a carriage accident in which he had broken his jaw. He also assigned Atzerodt to kill the Vice President, Andrew Johnson. And at Ford's Theater, he would kill Lincoln. When the Lincolns arrived at the theater that night, they had invited Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Hale. The band played Hail to the Chief as they walked to their box. At about 10 p.m., Booth snuck to the back of the theater. 15 minutes later, after Harry Hawk said, "You're sarcasming, old man, Trap," the audience was in laughter as Booth shot Lincoln in the back of the head. The bullet went through his brain. Major Rathbone saw Booth shooting Lincoln. Booth dropped the pistol and stabbed him in the arm with a knife in his hand. Booth then caught his spur on a flag while jumping to the stage below, causing him to break his left leg above the ankle. As he landed, he shouted out, "Sic semper tyrannis," the motto of Virginia, meaning, "Thus always the tyrants." Then he shouted, "The South is avenged." He then ran out the back door onto his horse, then escaped. At the same time, Lewis Powell and David Harold went to Secretary of State William Seward's mansion. Powell knocked on the door. He said he had medicine for Seward from Dr. Verdi, Seward's doctor. Seward's son, Frederick, refused to let Powell see the injured Secretary of State. Powell then quickly took out a gun from his pocket. He aimed the gun at Frederick, pulled the trigger, but the gun misfired. He then hit Frederick with the gun over his head. Powell then charged into Seward's bedroom and stabbed Seward 5 times. More people charged into Seward's bedroom, and Powell attacked him. Seward's daughter, Fanny, shouted, "Murder!" Harold heard Fanny shouting, and he fled Seward's house without Powell. Powell then dropped his knife and made a scream for the door. Seward later survived the wound, though he had his chin look funny for the rest of his life until his death in 1872. As Powell escaped the house, he shouted, "I'm mad! I'm mad!" Meanwhile, at the Kirkwood Hotel, George Atzerodt went to murder the Vice President, Andrew Johnson, but as he reached Johnson's residence, he lost his nerve and got drunk instead. Meanwhile, back at Ford's Theater, Dr. Charles Leo rushed to the president's box. He couldn't find Lincoln's wound. Lincoln wasn't bleeding at all. He just would not wake up. So now the question would be, where would the president die? It couldn't be inside Ford's Theater. Soldiers carried Lincoln from the theater to the Peterson boarding house across the street. They put Lincoln on a bed. He was too tall for it, so they had to bend his legs. He died at 7:22 the next morning, April 15th. He was 56 years old. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton announced, "Now he belongs to the ages." Meanwhile, in the Maryland countryside, Booth met up with Harold, and they went to the home of a doctor named Samuel Mudd, an old friend of Booth's. They stayed there for a night and left the next morning. Meanwhile, back in Washington, Stanton organized a manhunt for Booth and his accomplices. And he wanted every single accomplice of Booth to be captured. Meanwhile, in Maryland, Booth and Harold found the home of Samuel Cox and Thomas Jones. They both hid him in a pine thicket for 5 days. But the other accomplices were not lucky. Powell and Mary Surratt were caught at the Surratt boarding house in Washington. George Atzerodt was caught at his cousin's farm. Dr. Mudd was caught at his farm. Edmund Spangler, the man who held Booth's horse on the night of the assassination, was caught in Washington. Michael O'Laughlin was caught in Baltimore, Maryland. And Samuel Arnold was caught in Virginia. Booth read the newspapers in the thicket, and he was shocked. The newspaper said he was a tyrant instead of a hero. Our country owed all her troubles to him. On April 21st, Booth and Harold rode on the Potomac River to Virginia, but they made it north, so they tried again and they succeeded. Meanwhile, back in Washington, Abraham Lincoln's body was held in the East Room of the White House. just like in the dream he had 3 days before the assassination. A funeral train took Lincoln's body to Springfield, Illinois. Meanwhile, in Virginia, Booth and Harold were hiding at the Garrett farm. On April 26th, Union troops arrived at the farm. David Harold surrendered, and the troops took him to a nearby tree and tied him up. Booth, however, refused to surrender. The troops then set the barn on fire. A Union Army sergeant named Boston Corbett shot Booth in the neck. Booth fell to the ground immediately. The troops dragged him out of the barn and put him on the garret porch. Booth then whispered, "Tell Mother I died for my country." Then he asked to see his hands. He looked at them and whispered his last words, "Useless, useless," then died. He was only 26 years old. Lincoln's body arrived in Springfield on May 3rd, and he was taken to Oak Ridge Cemetery, and there he rests in peace. Booth's conspirators were brought to trial. Mary Surratt, George Atzerodt, David Harold, and Lewis Powell were sentenced to death. Michael O'Laughlin, Dr. Mudd, Edmund Spangler, and Samuel Arnold would be in prison for 4 years. Mary Surratt would be the first woman in history to be hanged. At 1:25 p.m. on July 7th, the platform fell and Surratt, Powell, Harold, and Atzerodt were dead. Lincoln was the first president to be assassinated, but he did a lot of great things as president. He signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, which helped free the slaves. He even brought the country back together during the Civil War. And that's what makes him one of America's greatest presidents. Stanton kept Booth's diary for 2 years. When it was released, 18 pages were missing. Booth thought he was going to be an American Brutus, but instead, he is an American nightmare held to the people. Some say Booth shot himself at the Garrett farm, but really, we know that Corbett shot him. The manhunt for him was the largest manhunt in American history, and the wanted poster the Union made was $100,000.